This is Dan Proft. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. My guest on this edition is Brian Timpone. He's the president and CEO of Local Labs. It's locallabs.com. The conversation today, media in the 21st century, something Brian Timpone knows a lot about. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Appreciate it. So let's start with what would seem like a baseline question, but maybe a little bit more complicated than people think. What is media? Because one of the things you told me many, many moons ago is that media is not what the Fourth Estate pretends it to be. Media is an instrument through which you build community.
Well, there's what media is and what the connotation of what media has been. They're kind of different sides of the coin. I mean, media, as it's perceived, is content, that's produced by someone produces content to attract an audience. But the truth is that media is anywhere where you can gather people, you can attract people, and it doesn't have to be content. It could just be conversation, amongst others, functionality, and that's kind of what the internet has. That's how it's changed things. I mean, it's extended what we traditionally thought media was. Hey, we were watching a television show. I'm reading the newspaper, I'm listening to the radio, that is media. Today, media is a message board. It could be even construed as email. Email it has all the same characteristics of media in the traditional sense. So technology has changed that, but it also leads to some more interesting questions about what is advertising and what it should be.
Well, let's stick on what is media first. We'll get to what is advertising in the digital age, but what is media and what's the future of these forms of media you just mentioned in passing? Print, television. I'm most interested in radio for my phony baloney job where they pay me a lot of money to talk on the radio for 20 hours a week. So what is the kind of landscape? And let's take them by sector, because you do at Local Labs, you do some interesting things as it pertains to print in particular. And why don't we start there? What is it exactly that Local Labs does, and how is that indicative of how print media, the major daily newspaper in a big city like Chicago, how that's changing and how you're part of that change?
Well, so Local Labs, the idea behind Local Labs was, how do you use technology to produce content more efficiently?
Original daily
content more efficiently.
Read the Tribune, right. Sometimes.
Right, and so I would posit that media has changed a great deal over the last 100 years. We've had transformations like this one already. Every time there's a new medium that becomes predominant, you see this change. So like if you went back to 1910, newspapers were the only medium that existed. And then all of a sudden radio emerges in the 20s. And radio becomes the predominant medium. Then broadcast television in the 50s and 60s, and then cable television in the 90s. Every time there was a transformation, there was a lot of disruption, and media was transformed in the same way it's been transformed today. The companies that emerged in every case were companies that took the new medium and leveraged it for what it uniquely allowed you to do. So newspapers, the printed word, if you look at old newspapers, I mean, they were thorough because it was the only way you could get any information. Radio allowed you to broadcast live, which was a really new thing. You couldn't get information in real time. You had to wait till the next morning. So, for instance, the first radio station that was successful was KDKA in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, and their first successful event that's kind of famous in media lore was that they broadcast the results of the Harding versus Cox election in 1920. At the time, the guy who did it...
Don't tell me who won.
At the time, the guy who did it, he was actually broadcasting out of his garage. He was a Westinghouse engineer. And he had asked Westinghouse if he could use the radio technology to put a radio station in his garage just for fun. And he had kind of built up a little audience in the community, housewives washing dishes, who would listen to him read the newspaper on the radio. And he had this great idea to broadcast, hey, I'm going to come in on election night, and I'm going to have my buddy go down and get the election results from the courthouse, and he's going to call me, and I'm going to read them over the radio. He also brought a band in to his garage because he thought this might be boring. And if it's boring, I want to have music to play because I don't want people to be disappointed. Well, every time the band played, people would call and they would complain and say, we want more election results. And that's when he realized that it wasn't about reading the newspaper on the radio, it was about live information. And so when broadcast television emerged, these big boxes that were expensive and involved all this production, the first shows that were on television were radio shows with ugly people and lack of visuals. And then Bill Paley at CBS and other geniuses said, why don't we put pictures of California and beautiful people on television?
Beautiful people like Walter Cronkite.
Well, Walter Cronkite was, it's beautiful. Well, look, beautiful and steadying.
Yeah, right.
But the bottom line was television took off because there was visual content, and people couldn't get that anywhere else. Cable television, same story. The first programming was just like broadcast. I'm 42. We might remember this as kids. WOR of New York, WTBS in Atlanta. It was the same thing as WGN. Cable didn't take off until people realized you could actually create these very tight segments around interests. And so the internet's here today, and it's another disruptive force. But the early entrants into the internet aren't maximizing what the internet really allows you to do.
But so the whole thing here is whether you're talking about print or radio or television or the internet, the whole thing is building content or building communities of interest around the content you're providing. And so they may be concentrated if you're one of the few that has a license to broadcast the 10 o'clock news on television, or they may be varied in the fractured media world of the internet.
Well, right, the internet, so if you think about attention used to be endless. That's why in the 90s, there was an endless amount of attention out there. We would watch that Mets game.
Because there was few outlets.
There were few outlets. So we would watch it, whatever was on, we would watch it. And cable capitalized on that. There was a big boom in cable in the 90s where they just kept adding channel after channel after channel after channel. And they were all successful because there was so much pent-up demand for media.
Right. How many reruns of ALF can you watch?
Well, but it's also ESPN 2 and 3 and ESPNU.
How many lumberjack competitions can you watch?
And so there was endless attention. And so now that cup has overflowed, right? So we are now...
500 channels, and you don't watch 480 of them.
We can pick whatever we want. So the problem with old traditional media today is that a lot of them produce as if we were in the previous era. They produce the same types of content that worked in that previous era, and because of inertia, it stays. But
I mean, is print the chief culprit in what you're describing? And go back to answering the question.
Yeah.
What are you doing in the print media space to try and transition major daily newspapers from what they used to do, where there were few outlets, to what they need to do to survive when there are many outlets? Well,
so print isn't a culprit. I mean, print is a fat and flabby, lazy, print metro newspapers, which produce probably fund 80 to 90% of the content you consume on any medium. Comes from, it's originated in the newspaper and then stolen by other outlets and repurposed, whether that's television or your radio or the internet. But these are businesses that, print metros are businesses that really, in Chicago in like the 50s, there were dozens of print metros. And that they all consolidated when television came along. And now the Chicago Tribunes of the world for 30 or 40 years just printed money. And it's taken this much time, like 15 years of the internet in competition, to watch them just whittle away their lead.
So over the last decade, newspapers have lost 50% of their revenue.
Right, and it will keep metro newspapers.
Right.
Right. So there's a distinction.
Big, major, urban daily newspapers.
When I think about media, I don't think about newspapers as a monolith. I mean, community newspapers, where they are run by real active owners, not metro newspaper owners. Like the Tribune ruins all of its community weeklies.
The community weeklies, we've talked about this offline, to borrow your phrase, community newspapers are proper nouns and pictures.
Well, that's what all media should be.
Okay.
Right?
Why?
Because that's all people care about. The only reason you read about Mayor Emanuel or Mayor Daley or crime or weather or the Bears, those were creations of mass media to try to get men who live in Lake Forest and Chicago Heights or women who live in Wheaton in Gary, Indiana, to have some sort of commonality. Mass media was about leveraging a TV tower that only went 50 miles, in a diameter, or a Chicago Tribune, which purports to be a metro paper and has trucks in the city center. Their goal is to try to get audience from Crystal Lake to Northwest Indiana. So what do? They make up storylines that have broad, what we would call mode appeal. Those are exposed in the internet world, because in the internet world you have ultimate choice, you have endless choice, right? So that story about a murder in Harvey, when you live in Lake Forest and have never been to Harvey, it wasn't interesting to you before, but it was the only thing that was on, right? So you watched it because there was nothing else to watch. Well, now that murder in Harvey is no different than a murder in Dallas or in Chile. It doesn't really matter. It's a place you'll never go. You don't know anyone from there. It's not really local to you.
And the criticism of major dailies, urban center dailies, not the community newspapers, is, they do multi-part exposés on what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, but they don't know, for example, in Chicago, what's going on in Schaumburg.
Well, I mean, that's a worthy criticism. I mean, look, newspapers, they're like the fly in your house. Big metro papers like the fly in your house that gets slow, and you just catch it with your hand. I mean, these are people who started out really strong, very capable. These businesses did, and over time they become arrogant and pretty incompetent universally. I mean, at one point the Chicago Tribune did have a bureau in Cuba, in Havana, Cuba. And then of course they're too good to go cover.
Castro's still a communist, right? Rinse and repeat.
They're too good to go cover Will County. But look, when you think about community newspapers, you're thinking about newspapers. I used to own a group of papers in Central Illinois, and I had one in a town called Tuscola, which had 4,000 people in the town. We had 3,600 paid circulation. Through no great efforts of mine, I bought it that way. The Hastings family had built this thing up over the years, and they had this paper that everyone picked up every week because it was full of junior high basketball scores and honor rolls, and just it was a way for people to know what their friends and family were doing.
Okay, but I mean, in Tuscola, you can get nearly 100% penetration, as you're describing, doing the proper nouns and pictures. The Chicago Tribune, trying to sell to a metropolitan demo of 5 to 7 million people, what is it they should be doing that they're not doing, and what's your role in trying to get papers like that to do what they should be doing that they're not doing?
So our role was to try to get them to go back and cover more local news. We probably had more success with other markets than we have with Chicago Tribune. That's another discussion for another day.
We'll get to that. Well, we'll get to that.
But what we have said to them is that you have to go back to the basics. The story of Tuscola is, Tuscola is 4,000 people who have an average income that's a fifth of a middle-income suburb. There is no media product with that kind of penetration in suburban America, and if there were, it would be not only welcomed, but it would be the most successful. They'd be the most profitable, successful products around. Metro newspapers like to cover Metro because it makes them feel important. It makes them feel like they have influence. It's not what people want to read. It never was. They never
It never was. I mean, there's the argument to be made that back in the day, Mike Royko could influence a mayoral election.
Well,
there's nobody that can do that today, even regardless of their writing talent. I mean, John Cass is a very talented op-ed writer for the Chicago Tribune, but he doesn't have the influence that a Mike Royko had. Is that just a function of the digital age, or is that a function of what newspapers have become, or some combination of the two?
Well, no, it's a function of look, media is fragmented, okay? Media has never been more fragmented, and it's going to continue to be more fragmented. The highest rated Monday Night Football game, I think, still is the Bears. I mean, the highest rated television shows are in the 80s, for good reason, because that's when we had fewer choices. I mean, just as one
better shows.
One example,
how can you beat Cheers?
The Royals World Series last year. I read this that they had 13 million or 11 million per game of viewership. In the last time they had been in the World Series, I think it was, or not the last time, but let's say it's 1980, it was 77 million was the viewership out of a total like 90 million households. Meaning everyone.
Yeah, but that was all George Brett related, right? And Willie Mays Aikens, UL Washington with the toothpick.
You're a little, you're George Brett for sure. But the thing was that back then there were fewer choices. We all coalesce around certain fewer things. So you're never going to have Mike Royko again, because Mike Royko, while he was great and inspiration to me as a child, one of the reasons why I went into journalism. People aren't just that interested in those types of things. They were never, right? But they read him because they had nothing else to read. I know it's hard to accept that for some people, but
so it's not a question. So this is interesting because you're essentially saying that it's not that people 30 years ago or 40 years ago were more civic-minded, more interested in kind of the salient issues of the day. It's just that they had fewer outlets, so they kind of used their downtime to consume Mike Royko, whereas if Mike Royko were writing today, he would be John Cass, he wouldn't be Mike
Absolutely.
Royko.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, that's an important distinction.
That's right. So,
or an argument.
Yeah, no, it's. But look, the real story here about media is that metropolitan, the sense of metropolitan, like your metropolitan you, right? You're from Wheaton, right? If you were in Mexico in 1950, you would have told someone, "I'm from Wheaton." In 1980, you'd say, "I'm from Chicago." Right? Wheaton actually was a place people went for the summer in the
They
1920s.
still do. It's a lovely
right?
community.
That's right.
Yes.
But that whole sense was manufactured. Okay, it was manufactured by guys like Colonel McCormick and by the owners of television antennas. They try to create this sense of commonality that really never existed. People in Wheaton really never had any great interest in Chicago. I mean, Chicago is trying to wreck the state today, but their interest was always very passing because they're interested in Wheaton like every other person in the world, right? We don't really care about how many murders there are in the west side of Chicago or how corrupt the city is. We don't live there. So that was created. That idea was created. So the idea that Mike Royko had this broad Chicagoland audience, I mean, today he would be just as popular as any columnist writing about politics, which isn't very, very popular. But I would say...
Well, I mean, let's not denigrate him with today's columnists. I mean, he was a much better writer and had much more insight into the human condition than, say, a Mark Brown. So he would still have appeal, but he just wouldn't have he would have an audience that's more reflective of people that are actually interested in public policy or politics, which is different than what it was perhaps 30 years ago, is the argument you're making.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that whether it's Mark Brown or John Cass or Dan Haley for the Wednesday Journal where I live, these guys all write columns, and the interest level, there's a broad interest level and then there's a deep interest level. And if Wheaton had its own Mike Royko, everyone in town would read it.
And so with again, let's separate the community newspapers, for example, the River Forest Daily News or some of these other local newspapers, whatever they're called.
The Forest Leaves.
Of course. Oh, it's lovely. Yeah, it's a nice bedroom community in which we live, of course, separated from the hoi polloi. But for the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, why are they circling the drain? And it's not just those Chicago newspapers, those Chicago dailies. This is happening in every market. I saw a Seattle newspaper fold up and close shop a couple of years ago.
Yep.
So what is it that they're not doing to adjust to the digital age? And what is it in terms of content production that Local Labs, your company, is doing to try and help those major urban dailies make that adjustment to the digital age?
Right, so they're circling the drain for like a fundamental business reason. It has nothing to do, let's just start where it doesn't have anything to do with all the kind of conventional wisdom. It has nothing to do with people's interests in various things that newspapers write about or don't, in kind of the esoteric, meaning it's not because they're not circling the drain because people aren't interested in news or newspapers, because they read newspaper-related content every day, all the time. I mean, everything you read was originated in a newspaper, everything you consume.
So this isn't back in my day, we used to read a newspaper kind of business.
It has nothing to do with that. Though
it's not intergenerational.
No, absolutely not. I mean, intergenerational. Young people have never read the newspaper, okay, and old people always have, because old people actually have real responsibilities.
And a stake in the game.
Right, a stake in the game. I mean, they also don't have time. They don't have as much time on their hands to just. It's like Mark Cuban said about Napster. Someone who's in their 20s who has nothing but time would spend 3 hours to download a movie, right? Someone who's 35 with kids, you come home and you're lucky if you have 5 minutes to find a show, right? Time is scarce. I speak for myself, right? So it's not because people's habits have changed. It's not because of the internet. It's not because of of mobile phones, it's because there's one fundamental structural issue with newspapers, which is that newspapers themselves they have not built in any sensitivity in their businesses between the product, the production group, and the actual revenue that comes in. Meaning, the Playboy Club, remember that TV show a couple years ago? It was on, it lasted like 3 or 4 episodes, right?
It looked terrible, I never saw it.
Looked terrible, it lasted like 3 episodes, and then they took it off the air. The guys who produced that came to whatever network ran it, I can't remember, and they said, hey, we have this great idea. We're gonna, it's gonna be beautiful women, and it's gonna be about Playboy, and we're gonna have drama, and they did it, and the audience hated it, and they took it off the air. The iPod, you ever have an iPod?
No.
I did, and then it was replaced by the iPhone.
I still use a Walkman.
that figures so.
And I love Rush Moving Pictures, which is the only tape that I play.
So the iPod was put out of it was eliminated from the product line of Apple. I think 3 years ago. Apple invented this thing, and then they got rid of it in 10 years. Newspapers have a product that is produced with absolutely no sensitivity to what advertisers want or what readers want, because daily Metro newspapers have basically insulated their newsrooms, almost like they've infantilized them. They've made them into this little protected cocoon that they can't feel any sensitivity to whether the stuff they're producing is of interest for subscribers or for advertisers.
So they're like a public sector union.
Very much like a government union, yes. And that's pretty much universal. And the reason it is that way is because for years, there was this perception amongst, because it was a golden goose. I mean, these people made so much money. There was a perception amongst the leadership of newspapers. I mean, Chicago Tribune being the best example. They made so much money that, those newsroom people, we can't screw with what they're doing because they're so smart. Whatever they're doing, we don't want to mess it up. And so all of a sudden, when we got to a competitive environment again, being competitive for attention, they've been flailing, and there's no way of forcing any change on those organizations. And heretofore, I mean, we have tried and failed to try to help newspapers. I'm saying grandly failed. We've succeeded in a small way, but we've tried to help newspapers impose change on the newsrooms or change the way they produce so that failure is accepted. It's very much like communism. If you never fail, you can never succeed. And newsrooms are never allowed to fail. I mean, they fail every day, but they just never accept it, right? So a nafpaper itself, a daily newspaper, a Metro, could build a thriving subscription business. People have never paid more money for content, yet they're afraid to get in the game. They spend tens of millions of dollars over at Chicago Tribune a year. I mean, way more money than you would ever imagine, and they don't compete for subscriptions.
So they don't believe in their content.
Well, it's not that. They just don't want to be held accountable for it. Okay. Meaning they've created a system where if the subscribers are down, it's not their fault.
So what's your system? Your system is, essentially you're arguing that major urban dailies should outsource their news production to you.
I don't think they should all outsource their news production.
Well, but isn't that what you do?
Community news, because they can't do it themselves.
Okay. But describe that. I mean, how can you and your group of writers
do it for a 20th of the cost?
Yeah. How?
Because we actually have accountability and rigor. We measure things. We hold people accountable for failing, and they make them improve. We don't just pay people for showing up. I mean, your average reporter over at Tribune Tower, they have 400 people in the newsroom last I counted. I mean, they'll write a story every 2 weeks. And the fully loaded cost of that is thousands of dollars for something that on the open market you could get for $50.
And in your opinion, is this the main reason why, for example, Chicago Tribune, which is a
Tribune Publishing,
which is a publicly traded company, is at a 52-week low and dropping?
It's the main reason, yeah. Well, I think that a stock price is reflective of how people see the future,
right? And
people they don't believe their answers in terms of how they're going to get out of it. Look, I mean, Jack Griffin, their CEO, went to Time Inc. and tried to change things, and the natives revolted.
Well, you tried to change things at Tribune, and I want you to tell this story because essentially you were brought in to do exactly what you're suggesting: reduce the cost of original news production at Chicago Tribune.
That's right.
And what happened?
So we went in and we took over all of Tribune Local, which was, they had 22 editions. They gave us 12 weeks to take it over. We did. And we were producing it for about a fifth of the cost. So saving them some good money, but also giving them, more important than saving money, was giving them a product that was sensitive to the market, meaning if people didn't like what we were producing, we would hear about it and change it. And that's a really important distinction. I mean, you're not going to be right all the time, but you have to be sensitive to people's perception, or to whether you're successful or not, right? And so that's what we gave them. But we had an incident of plagiarism. A writer lifted a quote out of a story. Obviously unforgivable, but in the grand scheme of things, you make mistakes, right? Tribune's had many instances of plagiarism, but they used it the newsroom used it as kind of a pretext to suspend us and try to.
And you immediately fired Joe Biden at that juncture.
That's right. Look, I make lots of mistakes. One of them was believing that the Tribune newsroom really wanted to be successful. But the bottom line was we were successful. They gave us an audit. They brought in a guy to audit us. He came in the meeting and he slammed his hand on the table and he was going to give us a proctology exam. And after about 2 weeks, he came back and said, "What you guys are doing is great. It's really cool. I think you're being wrongly perceived." And but by then it was too late. And because in the newsroom business, if your goal is in the news business, the Metro news business, the goal of much management is to make the newsroom happy. And if that's your goal, you're never going to be successful because they're only happy to help themselves, not to help the enterprise.
They want to. I mean, they're the candlestick makers against the advent of electricity.
That's exactly right. That's right. So I mean, look, there are lots of great people in these newsrooms. Personally, great, talented people, but they are completely buried beneath this corrosive system. That it is like a public employee union.
And despite that experience at the Tribune, you're still producing content in the same way you were for the Tribune at other major daily newspapers across the country.
Some of which I can't even name because they don't want to be associated with. I ruined journalism, as you know.
Yes,
but look,
you're the one.
But you were asking, like, how do we do it? How do you fix it? There's a kind of a simple business concept called cost of goods sold, right? You don't sell a drink or a cigar, or any good if you don't know what it costs you to produce the good, right? I mean, you know what it costs. You don't just say, "Oh, this is what I'm going to charge." Well, newspapers don't know how much it costs to produce their products because the newsroom is a big fixed cost. It's like, hey, we're spending this much no matter what you say, and because they don't know how to price it. They also don't have the sensitivity built in, and so as a result. In other words, they never have price pressure on their costs because they're not changing their costs no matter what management says. If you said to the editor of the Chicago Tribune, "Hey, listen, we got to get this business section done for less because we can't sell as many ads," they'd be like, "Go fly a kite. This is what we're doing."
I just want, speaking of print journalism in the digital age, you mentioned plagiarism. So we've had a number of scandals in print journalism, from Stephen Glass at New Republic to
from
Jason
Highland
Blair.
Park, by the way.
Oh, sure.
Chicagoan.
Yeah, another Highland Park Wall of Fame member they got to take down, like the president of Penn State during the Patino era. Jason Blair at New York Times.
Yep.
You've got the Rolling Stone false rape story at University of Virginia. Are these just instances where print journalism got it wrong, and you had some reporters who wanted to kind of make history, change the world rather than report the facts? Or are they indicative of something that has changed with respect to print journalism?
Well, so there's a journalism mentor of mine who has no college degree, but was city editor of the Tribune in the 60s. And he told me this once, and he was so right. He said, when I came up into journalism, it was a working class job. Because the job of journalism, the true job is getting information. It's not spinning a story and being famous, right? It's getting information. If you look back at old Tribune or old Sun-Times editions, there are no bylines, or very few bylines, because it wasn't about you and your ego.
But in the era of punditocracy and getting on cable news roundtables,
right. You
gotta kind of self-market. You got to brand yourself.
That's right, and Twitter's made it even worse, right? And we can get to that. But when he came up in journalism, with no college degree, he was a grinder and he got information, right? And being really good at getting information isn't some college educated. It's not a job. It's a job of knowing how to be friendly, how to go to a bar and talk to people, knowing how to build a network, right, of people. And those Jason Blair and Stephen Glass, these are people who were inspired by Watergate to be famous for themselves, to tell a story at any cost. And it's sad because they aren't the only ones. I mean, there are lots of people out there who do that. But they got into journalism for the wrong reasons. They got in journalism because they wanted to be famous. They didn't want to go and cover the truth or even just get information, period. Because every bit of information doesn't have to be agitating or revealing or some big expose. A couple years ago, there was a big scandal in Harvey, no shock, about they weren't paying their water bill. And there was a reporter at the Tribune who wrote it, and I saw him. Our office used to be in their building, and I asked him, I said, well, how did you find out about that story? And I knew what the answer was going to be, but I just wanted to hear. And he said, oh, someone called us and told us about it. And I mean, that's how they get their stories. These are not, these people.
Tipped off.
They get tipped off. They get tipped off by people who they don't cultivate. They get tipped off because they're the Tribune, by people who are using them. In the old days, when it was competitive, when there was the Daily News and the Sun Times, all these different competitors, you worked your sources and got information. And there are some ecosystems of journalism that still are competitive, very few. College football recruiting would be one. I mean, they're in the oddest places. But journalism isn't about, it's not about a name it's not about being famous. It's about getting more information. And the problem with the metros is that when you go to Chicago Tribune, you didn't go there to write city council briefs or cover an anniversary party. Yet that's what people really want to read, right? So that's why, so much what you read in the newspaper in metros is, it's written by a reporter to try to make themselves get the next job or to be famous or to impress their mom or to impress other journalists, and it's not written for consumers.
So the point is, it's about giving the people what they want, in your opinion, versus giving the people what you think they should consume.
Look, I mean, I would say that a journalist, a storyteller, someone in the media business should know what people want to consume. Okay, they should know. They shouldn't have to ask people what they want. That's why you're there, right? You should be great at starting a conversation and being interesting, right? There are great storytellers out there. I mean, amazing ones who do this all the time. But it's so raw, self-interested the way a metro works. I mean, the idea that the Chicago Tribune could spend $35, $40, $50 million a year on editorial and not do better storytelling than they do consistently, it's to me, it's kind of shocking.
So if Chicago Tribune, if Chicago Sun-Times, if they don't change their ways, are they going away, or are they always going to exist? They're just going to exist in kind of a different format with perhaps a different reach.
Well, I mean, they're already decidedly different than they were 5 years ago. I mean, hell, the Chicago Tribune had higher circulation in 1920 than they do today, when Chicago was smaller, a lot smaller. No, I mean, do they go away? For sure. I mean, they go away in any sense that you understand it, because their costs are so high. They're getting to the point where they can't economically serve. You can't pay, they spend, I think, $200+ million at Tribune Publishing on content. I mean, you can't support that unless you have an economic model. So no, I mean, they'll be gone.
But if they go away, another print outlet or a kind of digital version of a print outlet will arise to take their place that is more resilient, as you're describing it, or no? Or do we go back, or is it just everybody that used to consume the Chicago Tribune moves to digital consumption, television consumption, radio consumption?
Well, there is no consumption of anything if newspapers don't fund content. I mean, that's kind of the irony of the whole thing. I mean, BuzzFeed raised some boatload of money from a big venture firm in Silicon Valley, Andreessen Horowitz. They were really impressed with their technology, which is really impressive in terms of how they produce content and measure it. But the irony of that investment was that they take newspaper originated content and put it in their machine. That's their fuel. The fuel of media, digital media, is all newspaper funded. So when the Chicago Tribunes go away, the AP goes away. When the AP goes away, there is no Yahoo News. There is no There's no internet as you know it for news.
So what happens to television? Because I mean, television essentially
rip and read. I did it myself.
Yeah, it rips from the print.
Look, I mean, there is no future for any. And so
well, but wait a second, because Michael Wolff,
yes,
who's a media critic for the USA Today,
yep,
and in the book review of his book in the New York Times, television is the new television. Yeah.
Right.
Which is a very interesting read. You turned me on to it. It's a very, very interesting read. And by the way, the description of Michael Wolff in this New York Times book review is fantastic. Lest you think that antipathy towards Michael Wolff is a gimmick. No. People really hate him.
Right. Which
reminded me of what Ozzie Guillen used to say about A.J. Pierzynski. A.J. Pierzynski is one of those guys, when he's on your team, or when he's on the other team, you hate him. When he's on your team, you hate him a little bit less. But the interesting thing is that industry insiders like you say Michael Wolff has generally got it right. And actually, James Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's kid, who he's turning over the Fox News Corp empire to, has said television is the app in digital. Well, so how does television survive? How does television live up to what Michael Wolff and James Murdoch says it is if newspapers go away?
Well, so first of all, Michael Wolff not only is right, he's dead on, 100% accurate. I mean, his book is phenomenal, and I tell everyone I know who's in the business to read it, because
television is the new
television. Television is the new television. Yeah, I really admire. I think he's the most important thinker in media today. And if you're in media and you don't read him and believe him, you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, but most of the people who are in media are self-serving. He points this out all the time. To them, it's, I work for Politico. I have a stake in this. Look, I mean, when he says television is the new television, he's not saying that the television is the only successful medium. Television is different today. What he's saying is that the only successful models in digital are television models, and what television models are is subscription models. What he's really saying is the subscription model is the future, and he's right.
So Netflix is television, but they're producing their own movies, they're producing their own television series.
They're also paying $3 billion a year for television rights to traditional producers. Okay, so ultimately, the reason why Chicago Tribune is failing is because they have a digital, they have a print display model in print that is really most of their revenue. New York Times, the same thing, and then they have this digital ad model that doesn't work and is a disaster. And then they have a subscription model which they neglect, which is the most important business they have, which is getting people to pay for content and only giving it to the people who pay for it. I just watched the entire Game of Thrones 5-part series over the last few months. I caught up. I watched it. I pay for HBO. I watched it on my phone, walking to the train. It was a great experience, right?
So glad Tyrion is still alive.
It's my favorite character. Yeah, exactly. Right, yeah. But it was a great experience. There were no commercials. Cut right to it. Got right to that next episode, and I was happy to pay for it. And what Michael Wolff's point is that the only successful models online that use digital as a distribution mechanism are subscription models. And Netflix, is not a digital native company. I mean, yes, they distribute over internet lines, but they buy programming from. They buy programming the same way that 21st Century Fox did. They're no different than a television studio. When they produced the show with Kevin Spacey, House of Cards, they paid the same people the same amount of money, right? Subscriptions, the future of media is people paying for content, right? With no advertising, or if there is advertising, it's Don Draper before the thing talking about BMW for 30 seconds. That's it.
So I mean, ultimately, boil this all back down. Whether you're talking about print or television, we haven't got to radio yet, but essentially the same. Content is king. If you're a good original content provider, if you're a good storyteller, then that really hasn't changed over the last half century. It's just the medium through which you pipe the content and how you charge for it.
Right. It's always been king, right? It's always. So
it's not the technology. It's still the content.
It's always been the content. It's just a matter of
why. So why don't newspapers and television studios and radio stations understand this?
Well, I think some do. I mean, television studios are making out big because Showtime, CBS. They're all going over the top, as they call it. The cable bundle's disintegrating. I mean, hell, Comcast doesn't even want the cable bundle to exist. So you're going to have the ability to buy content directly from great producers, and we're in a renaissance. We're in the best era of let's call it video television is the word content that we've ever been in. I mean, as much as I loved Love Boat and Fantasy Island, Showtime, HBO, and House of Cards or Game of Thrones are far superior.
And that's the way we're going. Whereas
right.
you don't have to, if I want to have certain cable stations, but I don't want to watch women's softball on the Big Ten Network, then I'm not going to have to buy the Big Ten Network. It's going to be a la carte.
Well, I mean, so incentives matter, right? And incentives create perverse behavior that seems like it's progress, but it's really not. And so I'm glad you mentioned the Big Ten Network, because the cable bundle, the biggest casualty of the death of the cable bundle is going to be college sports. There's been all this, hubbub about how, there's never been more money in it, and it's so great. And the Big Ten, they just added Rutgers and Maryland so they could jam a mandated cable fee down the people of New York and Washington. They don't want this. I mean, no one wants to pay for the Big Ten Network. No one would pay for it. And the only reason they do is because they're forced to. And once they're given a choice, and if you have children, you know this inherently, they don't watch television. They don't watch cable. They watch Disney, which you'll pay for eventually. They watch very specific things. The cable bundle is a relic, and as it collapses, it's going to incentivize more programming. We're going to pay for programming we want to see, right, and not programming that's kind of forced upon us through cable television machinations. I mean, don't forget that the cable channels that you buy in the bundle are owned by a handful of companies.
Well, I want to get to radio
because
my financial interests are at stake here. And so in the digital age, in the on-demand world, how does talk radio survive? And forget little fish like me, and think about even big fish like Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or Mark Levin, where people aren't going to tolerate 30 minutes on the hour of commercials, traffic, and weather. And oh, by the way, the average car on the road is 11 years old, but a decade or 2 decades from now, the average car is going to be a Tesla where they don't even have a radio. It's all internet-based. So what is the model for talk radio? How should talk radio, or radio just even in general, think about the kind of coming revolution?
Look, I mean, advertise. No one's going to pay. No one will pay. There are a couple principles. No one's going to pay for advertising to be piped into their home or into their phone or anything else, because you're paying for bandwidth, right? It wasn't so self-evident, until now, but now it really has become that way. Meaning, if I'm paying for AT&T to send me, a gig of download a month, I'm not going to pay for half an hour of your show to be you reading ads about Emperor's Chi and the pillow, right?
My pillow.
My pillow, which is, by the way, great. It
conforms to how you sleep.
It's a great pillow, by the way.
It helps with the neck and back
I've actually
issues.
heard that. Not that I didn't hear about it from your show.
Yeah.
But so people aren't going to pay for advertising like kind of in that format, but people still crave content. So, and they still they love the audio format, because it's a format that lends itself to just part of people's daily habit. It's driving.
Well, it's also a little bit different than print or television that's intimate, because it's two-way.
Well, two-way,
so it's different than being kind of content being pushed at you, or whether it's in print form or in television form and kind of visual form. When you have this interchange where you're having a conversation and the other party in the conversation is the listener, that is a different format.
Yeah, well, it's as an example, much television would be better off as radio. Fox News Sunday is an example, like a Sunday morning talk show. It's just a conversation. It's just as easy to listen to a podcast. But no, I think it's a flight to quality. I mean, if you have, I think that the days of the shock jock and the mass audience goes away, because that was built for the old mass audience era. I love Johnny B, but there isn't really room for Johnny B in the future.
Not familiar with him.
Yeah, he's been gone for quite some time.
Yeah.
But I think that higher minded or targeted, whether it's business or politics, with a few key sponsors who really demand that context, I think it'll persist. I mean, because the devices are very pro audio. I mean, it's listening to the podcast on an iPhone is a great experience, but it's not a great experience with advertising. So I think, look, everyone says terrestrial radio is going away, and I don't. It'll be here as long as it's going to be here, right? But the programming itself.
Howard Stern thought that, and he may ultimately be right or he may not, but he certainly wasn't right on the timeline he thought he was going to be right.
Well, it's marketing for a bigger idea, right? I mean, if you have a show in the morning and lots of people listen to it and they want to hear more Dan Proft, and you should give them more Dan Proft without commercials or with one
I only
advertiser.
have so much Dan Proft to give.
Well, I could listen to as much as you can give me.
No, well, thank you very much.
But I think but again, it's about content quality, not gaming a system or what device it is. It's about if you we talked about this offline about our we're both fans of Milt Rosenberg. I mean, his show couldn't be longer, couldn't be more random, and I love it. Right?
Well, but I mean, Milt Rosenberg is the classic example that all axioms are true, and the first axiom of business at any level, any sector. Give value first. And Milt Rosenberg gives value to his listener.
Yeah, and he needs help, I think, and I think as I think you'll need help going forward with finding the right types of sponsors for this quality. But I think they're coming because the gig is up with digital advertising with some of these newfangled ideas, and so people are finally starting to pay. Like advertisers will finally in the next kind of era, I don't know what 0.0 we're in, but. The advertisers will start once again be paying attention to the context around where their ads exist, not just how many people they reach.
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk about that to wrap up here. I want to talk about advertising because what we're talking about essentially, these are businesses.
Yeah.
A newspaper, a television station, a radio station, they are for-profit businesses. And so you need some kind of revenue model. The revenue model has been advertising. And it's the same thing in the digital space. And there's an interesting piece recently in Bloomberg that is creating quite a buzz that basically says that the internet is being rotted out by false traffic. The metrics that people use to try and identify what penetration they're getting or what audience they're building through Facebook ads and display ads online, it's all, frankly, a scam. And I kind of want you to comment on that and what that means for the migration to the digital space.
Well, again, let's just, before we get into that, there's no migration to the digital space.
Okay.
There's no great migration. I mean, media, today.
Well, what are podcasts? That's not a migration to the digital space.
What do people listen to on podcasts? They listen to This American Life.
Right.
It's the most popular podcast. It was created in the early 90s for public radio.
And Ira Glass is a great storyteller.
Right. He did a story once about us, which was funny in itself.
And not complimentary.
No, not completely. I still listen to him. I get it. So, no, I think that the digital advertising was always, we were talking about incentives. I mean, it was always built on a false premise. The false premise is, and the false premise is related to your previous question, is that every impression has value, right? So impressions themselves, on television, you're going to see this commercial. It's going to encompass all your senses, so you're going to see it. But on the internet, an advertising impression, a click, you don't notice anything, and it was never a good place to advertise. Much less today, the way it's been bastardized to the point where Allstate will place an ad and it's on a porn site or on a blog spam site, and they don't even know it, or it's on a site that's not even a site.
Well, it's worse than that, at least according to this Bloomberg piece I referenced. They're suggesting that 2% of those digital ads are actually viewed by humans, that they're mostly viewed by software.
True. Right.
So it's fake traffic that you construct when you launch a website in order to build fake audience to try and get real advertisers.
Yeah.
So it's a scam.
Yeah, and so what drove it? Mania. The mania starts, I think, with people who are, I got to be in digital. My CEO said I need to be in digital.
Right.
I need to spend money on it. So the Kellogg guy they quoted in the article, I got to buy some digital. I go to my agency and say, hey, I need to buy some digital from you. And they said, all right, we'll get you this audience. It's like, it's not enough. I get more from American Idol. How do I get that kind of audience? And then they start manufacturing it. They give them what they want. And the worst thing is the agencies trade against their own clients, which is kind of what's ended up happening. It's become a game of, hey, I'm going to spend $5 million, and the agency goes and tries to find that $5 million worth of audience for the least amount of money and keeps the middle. That's the sad game that's going on today, and digital advertising has driven it. And ad tech, as they call it, is this booming business with public companies, and I think it's going to all collapse.
Well, in this story, this article we're referencing, there's an anecdote of a Heineken executive. They're at a meeting talking, and they've got a $150 million ad budget, and they're going through this PowerPoint presentation essentially, and they're told that the digital advertising, which everybody's gung ho about, return on investment was about 2 to 1. Their television advertising, which is kind of the proverbial spaghetti against a wall, was 6 to 1.
Right.
And everybody at the meeting is stunned, and they don't know who's going to be fired. They don't know how to react to that. And so, what does that say about how companies, whether they're media outlets or consumer product companies, how they should view digital versus print versus radio versus television?
Look, digital doesn't work for anything other than direct response. For a brand advertiser, I would never spend a penny on digital unless I knew that I was buying direct from a publisher, from a media company, and I knew what the programming was, and I knew what I was getting. I'd also be realistic about what I was getting. The numbers are all BS, obviously, and lies beget more lies, and that's kind of where it's ended up. But in terms of how you measure ROI in digital, look, it's not television. It doesn't. You can't hear it. You can't really see it. It's a terrible place to advertise. We used to use the example, it's comparable to an ad on a phone call, right? Imagine if you're on the phone and you hear an ad running in the background. It's just annoying, right? And annoying just people won't stand for.
Whether it's a pop-up or
right. So if I were a digital ad buyer at a big company, I would prepare to find a new way to use digital media, and the new way is back to the old way, which is underwriting content that finds your audience. It's a huge opportunity for them. They just have to think a little more creatively. Ad agencies used to be creative. They invented the paper towel holder. They created the NFL and all this programming in the old days. They used to look at a medium and say, how do we use this medium to create programming that leverages all those ideas were created by agencies, by creative ad execs. Today they just buy media.
Maybe as a radio talk show host, I should wear a jumpsuit like Jeff Gordon and just have corporate labels all over me. I'll live stream it, right? Can we pay for that? Hey, let me ask you a question before we let you jump. One of the great things about the digital age is that you can build your own castle, and you can do it relatively cheaply, and you can build your own castle online that turns out to potentially have more readership, more legitimate traffic, more eyeballs, and in terms of engagement, engaged eyeballs, engaged human beings reading your blog or your media outlet than the Chicago Tribune gets, and that is a seismic shift in terms of the balance of power. So if you were starting a news-oriented website today, how would you conceive it in the context of the media landscape that we've been discussing?
Well, you have to make sure that revenue follows costs. It's kind of that simple. So if you're starting a media outlet today, and I am starting several, so I'm in the business. You first look for an area of opportunity in terms of a community that's not being served. So the community could be river forest. It could also be parking lot investors.
It can be a geographic. It can be a psychographic.
Whatever. The beauty of the internet is it allows you to be as targeted as you want to be. And as long as you're not susceptible to the mania of how many people you reach, and you focus on reaching the right people with really rich information in a targeted way, you can be successful at 500 visitors a month if it's the right 500 visitors. And that's, I think, what has been lost on people in this current debate. It's like, BuzzFeed has hundreds of millions of visitors. They're all bubblegum smacking teenagers looking at cat videos.
know how much that's worth? Zero, right? And worse than that, it's flooding the market with more inventory. I mean, that's the problem with, Facebook and BuzzFeed and Huffington Post. All they do is generate all this supply that's worthless, right? And so it's worthless supply. I mean, mass media content generally is worthless on the web. The Bears game story that you read on the Tribune website is not of any value to an advertiser. It's mass media content.
The Bears game isn't of any value to an
advertiser. It's mass media content on a targeted medium, meaning you need targeted content. So to answer your question again is find really niche areas and win there. And there are people doing it. I mean, there are people doing, and that's where you're going to see success in the future is, find a niche, find a targeted area. You don't have to conquer the world because we're not all interested in China. We just aren't. I'm more interested in my walk to the train, where my kids go to school, how much I'm paying in taxes, my life, right? Those other things were always distractions, and they never were of that. I was never that deeply interested in, and no one really was. So that's what I would do, and that's what I'm doing, and hopefully. And 10 years from now, the kind of the right principles will win the day. I think they will.
He is Brian Timpone, the CEO of Local Labs, locallabs.com, who joined us on this edition of Against the Current. Brian Timpone, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Dan.
it.
It was fun.